So I'm Paul Jarman, I'm Assistant Director of Transport and Industry at Beamish Museum, responsible for the transport collections and enjoyer of this 1922 Model T. So this was actually built in 1922, but it's masquerading as a 1916 vehicle. In the First World War, the London North Western Railway had the daughter of the Chief Mechanical Engineer propose an idea to help out the troops, which was some sort of motor transport behind the front lines on the very lightly laid trench tramways. And the idea they hit upon was using Model Ts, which were built in Trafford, and the London North Western Works was at Crewe, so it was a fairly local entity. And the idea they had was they would take a standard Model T, strip it down, so it was just basically a chassis that would drive, and put a flat body on it, and then a dismantleable railway frame which would fit underneath. So you could turn up on your 2-foot gauge railway, sort of drive astride the tracks and assemble the frame underneath, allegedly within an hour, although probably not something you'd do under fire, and then you would convert it into a railway tractor. And it's called a Crewe Tractor, although obviously it isn't very tractor-like in its appearance. It seems that when most of them were converted, they stayed converted, so we think there were 132 of them in total, and the photographs that exist tend to show them being pushed as well as being driven, so adhesion was quite possibly a problem, although there are photographs of them pulling fairly short trains of munitions and so on behind the front lines. But the idea really was they were a kind of means of officers and so on inspecting their lines without having to get bogged down in the mud and so on of the Somme. The vehicle was converted at Beamish. It was in fact a bread van when it came to us, and we had initially had it sign written as a Sunderland Steam Laundry. It was okay in that form, but not very practical because we're bigger these days, and it was quite hard to see out of, and it tended to fall out of favour for being used around the museum. And as it was due an overhaul, the opportunity came to do something different with it. Curatorially, it's not too savage, as it wasn't actually a van when it was first built. It's an American import. As you can see, it's left-hand drive rather than right-hand drive. But that, you know, with the type of vehicle it is, doesn't really make a great deal of difference to us. And it was brought into the workshops, and largely the work of 2 volunteers who sort of spent about a year both overhauling and adapting it. We had photographs to work on from which to copy, although subsequent to its completion, as is always the way, the drawings for the originals have turned up in the National Railway Museum, so that will be very useful when we get to the next stage of the project, which will be to build the narrow gauge part of it and try it on the railway track. There are a few differences to the original. We've kept the running boards because that's just a practical feature really for getting on and off, and with it not being in railway guise at the moment, they're not in the way. The petrol cans aren't something I've seen evidence of them carrying, but the transport side was in 2 parts. You had the War Department light railway system, over which these were operating in part, but actually it was the Motor Transport Service who operated these particular vehicles, and all their lorries tended to carry the POW cans. That's paraffin, oil and water. It's not prisoner of war, nor is it petrol. Petrol cans were always left the colour they came, which was usually green or red. Paraffin for the lights, and oil and water obviously to sustain the running. The boxes on the back are useful for hiding things like the laptop and so on when travelling between offices, as the vehicle is in use every day and it's sort of become my daily run around on site. And whilst a lot of people say, oh, you must get wet, you don't get any wetter on this than you would walking. We've got 3 Model Ts in the collection, and we are currently recommissioning a Tourer, which is a 1914 vehicle. When Fords established themselves at Trafford in Manchester on what became the Trafford Park industrial estate, they imported initially all the components and assembled the vehicles there, and it was only later that they were manufacturing them from first principles. So the 1914 Tourer that we've got in the workshop at the moment is one of those. It's an American import, although the bodies were built locally in Manchester, and it was assembled in Manchester. It is supposed to have also had a First World War active life, but I've found no real kind of evidence for this. And certainly any photographs of staff cars that were Model T Tourers, they're always filthy, muddy, and certainly weren't painted green. So we'll be leaving it in its guise as a kind of standard, any colour you like as long as it's black, Henry Ford Model T. After that we've got a ton truck, and the ton trucks were a slightly uprated version, had a longer chassis, and they were lower geared, and they were called ton trucks because they weighed less than half a tonne in themselves, and you could load them with half a tonne and still be under, in total, a tonne in gross weight. And this was an advantage in terms of taxation classes. It was a huge advantage, in fact, to operators who then set about grossly overloading them throughout their lives. You know, 2-3 tonnes was not unknown. So we've got one of those at the moment, again an American import. It's been used around the site for the last 3 or 4 years regularly, but it's fairly tired, and we'll rebuild it with an English cab and probably a refuse body on it for emptying bins and so on. So this Model T is my sort of staff car really. It's a run around. And it was always intended as such, so most days that I'm on site it'll be out and around the museum. It is a working vehicle, has a working life again, rather than being preserved as such. It's not actually part of the museum collections, it's not been accessioned, it's deliberately kept separate. It'll be out for the Great North Steam Fair in April, so you'll be able to see it there, because it'll be again the staff run around, and most events and activities throughout the year. So if you do see it, that's its origins, and it also means people now find me. If they find the Model T, they find me.